Chapter 40 Bancroft House, Somerset, England, June 26th, 1889. Hayley had become used to the darkness. She was used to the echo of nothingness which swallowed her screams. And more than anything, she had become used to the ropes which bound her wrists. It was for that reason it felt so strange now, with the ropes shredded and her hands free for the first time in weeks. She had noticed the jagged hole in the floor and one of the many times Sherbet had come down to taunt her. They had thrown her easily across the ground, where she had cut her bicep on the sharp stone, in a place where the chunk of rock had been knocked out or had simply eroded away with time. It had taken Hayley a few days to put her plan into action. Mostly because it had taken a few days for the fuzziness in her head to clear from being thrown against the walls, and for Seven to return with enough food and water to bring her reluctantly back to the edge of life. They had waited a while before finally attempting to escape, allowing Sherbet one last gloating visit so she was sure she would not be interrupted. She had dragged her body across the room, shuffling inch by inch across the cold, coarse ground before searching the floor desperately with her numb fingers for the spot she had found. Hayley positioned herself in just the right way to saw at her bonds with the edge of the jagged stone. It had not been perfect. As she rubbed her bruised wrists, she could feel warm blood trickling through her hands from where she had scraped and cut herself against the rocks. Her open wounds burned when she touched them, and she could feel the constant sting as blood seeped into her open blisters where the ropes had rubbed her skin raw. Hayley did not scream at the pain. She barely whimpered. So long in there, at the hands of Sherbet, and even David, when he needed to let out some rage, had taught Hayley more about pain than she ever wanted to know. She could bear the hurt, just for a little longer, until she could find Mumbu and warn her. Perhaps then they could go to the police. A search for Ray would be pointless if Sherbet was correct and he truly was dead. But Jamie could still be out there, and Will, perhaps, if he hadn't already fled back to his steamship in the heart of Africa. Hayley spent a good deal of time rubbing the feeling back into her wrists and ankles, despite the pain the motion caused. It would be temporary, she knew that. She just needed to get out of there. That's all she needed her tired and beaten limbs to do. Carry her out. She didn't know what time it was. Her prolonged exposure to the darkness and frequent periods of unconsciousness had thrown any sense of time askew, and she could only hope that, night or day, the weather would shield her escape once she made it out of the building. Provided she could find a way out, of course, and provided there was somewhere for her to run to. She shakily got to her feet, pressing her aching arms against the cold wall to steady herself. Hayley groped blindly in the darkness, shuffling desperately along until they felt the wood of the door beneath their skin, and finally the rusted metal handle. It was locked. She could have guessed that were the case, and in fact was prepared for it, and yet still her heart sank. Hayley braced herself against the wall and lifted a hand to her tattered clothing. She had been painfully aware of the mangled boning of her corset for weeks now, having it poke and stab at her soft skin through thin layers of fabric, and it was not difficult to pull one of the wire strands from the piece. She wrestled it out of her corset and felt the thin piece of metal between her fingers. Hayley's numb hands slipped, and the wire went toppling to the ground with a clatter which echoed louder than church bells in the musty cellar. They stood motionless for a very long time, pressed against the stone wall and waiting for someone in the house above to have heard, for Sherbet to come downstairs at the noise and catch them in their escape. This to be the end. This had to be the end. Yet no one came. No one arrived at the other side of the door. It was just Hayley and the darkness. She bent down and searched the floor for the wire, fingers eventually settling on it not too far away. Hayley had never picked a lock before, and it took her a considerable amount of time crouched in front of the door to hear the heavy iron rod lift up and click into place. She let out a silent prayer at the simplicity of the lock. Had it been any more complex than a single pin, perhaps she would have rotted down here after all. Carefully, Hayley turned the handle and opened up the door into another dark room. It creaked loudly, and she once again froze, waiting. They could smell old smoke and dirt as they inched around the edge of the room, and the metal piping which brushed against their hands more than anything indicated that this room housed the large coal burner which would have run the manor's heating, if it had been used. She realized dimly in the back of her mind that she must have been locked in a coal or wood storage room. Her foot found purchase on a stair, and very slowly Haley pulled herself up, step by step, towards another door. She could see the faintest slivers of grey lights around the door's edges, and she paused and searched for noise on the other side. There was nothing, and she pushed the door open. Even the faint moonlight which trickled through the hole burned Haley's eyes, and she pulled the door half closed again to shield herself while her vision adjusted. She preferred this to the daylight, at least. It didn't incapacitate her long, and she found herself shuffling louder than she would have liked through the hall, propping herself up on wooden chests and bare white walls, as she moved towards the source of the moonlight, ignoring the trail of blood she was leaving behind her. She rounded a corner and came face to face with a large window, which opened onto the sprawling grounds of Bancroft House. A light spitting rain tapped on the glass and bathed the night in shades of grey, robbing the grassy and overgrown lawns beyond of any colour found in the blankets of wildflowers. Haley fought back a sob of happiness as she stepped closer, pressing against the glass. Her breath fogged up the window, and blood smeared from her hand onto the cold panes. It felt like an eternity since she had seen the grey English sky and the empty world beyond. She couldn't make noise, not now when she was so close to freedom, but she allowed her tears to flow freely down her cheeks, dripping onto the wooden floor below where they mingled with drops of her blood. She knew she was leaving a trail, but right now it didn't matter. It wouldn't be important if she got out now. Any blood would be lost to the rain and the dirt once she reached the gardens. As she leant against the window, Haley scanned the dark facade of the building for a doorway, a reference for where to go and how to get out. There was a large hedge beyond the gardens, it seemed, and plenty of trees for cover, but no gate that she could see. Once she made it off the grounds, she would have a clear shot to the road where she could hopefully find some village, or perhaps even a single cottage to take refuge in. Her eyes landed on an entryway to her left. Freedom. Haley made her way toward it through the halls, not encountering a single soul on her way. It almost seemed too easy. They strained their ears, listening for signs of life in the house. There were voices somewhere in the manor, along with distant, pacing footsteps. A few people, perhaps, or just one. It was hard to tell. The house echoed and relayed sounds all around her in indistinct muffles and scrapes. She wondered if her screams had made it through the walls and into the house after all. Had anyone heard? Would anyone have cared if they had? Haley pushed the thought away as she entered the sprawling entryway. Light flooded down the open stairways, which curled around the walls of the foyer from the second floor. The sound of voices were louder now, with less layers of wall between them and Haley. She forced herself to slow down as she inched towards the door, dragging her quivering legs one before the other. She could hear every breath she took and every drop of blood that dripped onto the floor. Every shift of her numb feet on the wood beneath them. The noises were muffled slightly when she stepped onto a carpet which spanned the center of the room, but still taking steps on its woven surface felt too loud. Everything was too loud. The wind picked up outside, and Haley heard it rattle the glass at the foyer windows and shake the wooden door on its hinges. She leant against it, pressing her fingers down on the latch. The door swung open beneath with a light creak as the wind blew droplets of rain inside in the cool evening breeze. This was it. She was free. She was out. Haley didn't listen for the voices upstairs as she slipped outside and pulled the door closed behind her with the gentle click of locks and the thud of wood. She gulped down the humid summer air, fresh and tinted with the taste of storms and damp grass. She felt the misty rain on her raw skin and the gravel and dirt beneath her feet as she stumbled as quickly as she could across the lawns, racing as fast as her battered bones would carry her across the grounds of Bancroft House. She was running now, eyes locked on the horizon, guiding her directly away from the prison she had been locked in for so many days now. This was the feeling of freedom, of being alive. Haley heard the sound before she registered the pain. The brutal crack, louder and more violent than any clap of thunder, splitting the air around her to shards. She screamed without knowing why as she felt herself be thrown forwards, and her unsteady limbs crashed to the ground where she tumbled a few more feet. They had at first registered the spray which hit their face and neck as only more rain, but now she could smell the blood, fresh and warm. They could feel their shoulder going numb and cold as blood spilled out from it, coating the ground and soaking into their clothes. The pain rocketed through her body in burning waves, setting every nerve on fire. Haley tried to move, clawing her way across the dirt, and she screamed again as her arm gave out beneath her, muscles torn and useless against the gaping bullet wound in her shoulder. Another gunshot echoed through the night, and Haley watched a chunk of dirt explode beside her head as she continued to scramble across the wet earth. She cast a glance over her shoulder and saw a silhouette of Sherbet striding towards her across the grass, cocking their pistol as they drew closer and closer. Haley screamed again, desperate for someone to hear, for anyone to come to help. She couldn't fail now. Not this close to escape, this close to warning the others of the danger they were in. Sherbet reached Haley easily, and they kicked her in the wounded shoulder, knocking the woman onto her back with a gasp and a cry of pain. Haley tried to struggle away again, and the chemist placed a boot on their chest, crushing their lungs and pinning them in place. "Let me go!" Haley screamed, thrashing about hysterically as she fought uselessly against Sherbet's weight with their one working arm. "Let me go! Get off me, Sherbet!" Sherbet made a soft sound as they leant down, digging their weight further into her chest, threatening to crack her ribs beneath their soul. "Oh, Haley. I can't do that." They reached down with a hand stained purple from within and brushed a strand of Haley's wild and unkempt hair out of her face, looking her in the eyes. "I am sorry it had to come to this," Sherbet sighed. "I really didn't want to do this. In fact, I'm surprised you did. There were easier options to choose." Haley was barely listening as they struggled, sobbing messily as the pain from their shoulder spread across their torso in roaring aches. Her breathing was ragged, caught behind spit and blood and snot as she sobbed, trying to move from underneath Sherbet. "This is worse for you too, you know. At least down there, if someone had come looking for Athena, they might have found you too. You might have been rescued, Haley. Or at the very least, you could have had company. I hear Jamie is quite fond of small spaces these days. I'm sure there was plenty of room in that cellar for both of you." Sherbet chuckled coldly. "And to think you were just about to throw away my kindness by going off and telling people all about this. I thought I'd earned at least some loyalty by keeping you alive. But I suppose that's just my lesson learned. I've been too soft. That's why Endirian won't talk to me, I'm sure of it. I'm not ruthless enough. Well, we'll see about that." They stepped back off of Haley's chest, and the woman heaved in a massive, gurgling breath. Sherbet watched them as they rolled onto their stomach, wounded arm pinned to their chest as they wormed their way across the grass towards the distant hedge. "Oh, really? That's just sad to watch," Sherbet sighed. "And to think I really thought you were smarter than this, that you would have waited it out to be rescued. But you know what, Haley?" Sherbet asked as they strode slowly behind her. "It doesn't matter now, because you're not going anywhere. No one is looking for you." "No," Haley managed to mumble, shaking her head. "No, that's not..." Sherbet stood up straight and pointed their gun at Haley's back as she clawed at the earth. "No one is looking for you, Haley, and no one is going to miss you." Another gunshot split the air, and all was silent. Sherbert breathed in the sharp, burning scent of gunpowder and smoke as they looked down at the limp body on the ground that had once been Haley. Somewhere, trapped in the back of their mind, they sobbed, screaming in subconscious sleep. Sherbert shrugged it away. They watched as Haley's blood soaked into the earth, and the rain flecked at the crater of her back which had been blown away by the bullet. They took another breath of air, and the rain and earthy scents overpowered with sulfur and gore assaulting their nostrils. This had been a mistake. It was a mistake they hadn't killed her sooner. David had been right, and gods did they hate it when David was right. It was almost too late this time. There wouldn't be another slip-up. Sherbert could send 7 out to deal with the body. With any luck, this whole mess would be over by the time the sun rose, and they could go back to focusing on what was important. Opening the portal for Endirion, once and for all. Sherbert Quakeson walked calmly away from the lifeless body of one of their closest friends.